My task here is to highlight some issues, some problems about the relation of religion, dignity, and the secular state. Some of the issues about neutrality and toleration came up earlier, especially in Rebecca Brown's paper and the discussion, and I want to follow up on this. What I would like to suggest for a start is that when we look at Professor Dworkin's work on neutrality and the secular tolerant state, we might distinguish three phases, P-H-A-S-E, not F-A-C-E, because there's always one Dworkin there, but three different stages in his work. And what I would like to pose as a question is whether there is an ambivalence, especially whether whether I'm right to perceive a certain ambivalence in the recent phase of Dworkin's theorizing, especially the one we find in the book Is Democracy Possible here, between Dworkin phase 1 and Dworkin phase 2, and I might then make a suggestion as to how this could be resolved. Now, phase number 1, which I call the phase of neutralist liberalism, I locate around the publication of the famous books Taking Right Seriously and A Matter of Principle, and its most explicit reference point is the famous article called Liberalism. The main argument here is that government does not treat its citizens as equals if it bases its decisions on particular conceptions of the good about which there is deep disagreement, which cannot and which need not be resolved by principles of justice. Broadly within a Rawlsian framework, Dworkin argues that the liberal conception of equality, and I quote, is a principle of political organization that is required by justice, not a way of life for individuals, end of quote. Now, since the time of that publication, there has been an intense debate about the many meanings and possibilities of state neutrality. And even though in the course of these debates, which of course Ronald Dworkin contributed to immensely, in the course of these debates, Professor Dworkin did not completely change his position with respect to the distinction between justice and the good life, but we find a different nuance. We find in this second phase, and I call that the phase of ethical liberalism, that he argues against a Rawlsian discontinuity between justice and the good. Rather, liberalism now is seen to be, quote, continuous with the best personal ethics, with the right philosophical view of the good life, end of quote. The approach to liberal ethics that is worked out in the Tanner lectures, especially this is what I mainly refer to in this phase, on the foundations of liberal equality, the approach that is worked out in great detail tries to square the circle, I might say, of giving higher order ethical reasons for a liberal state that still is neutral with respect to first order conceptions of the good that do not violate basic liberal principles of right. And in the following, I should say that when I say ethical, I do mean it in the sense in which Professor Dworkin referred to it this morning, questions of the good life. And when I say moral, I mainly refer to that realm of reasons which apply to how we should treat other persons. In Professor Dworkin's view in this period, the liberal conception of justice is backed by a liberal conception of the good, which does not just explain the point of being tolerant and just with respect to the good life of other persons, but also with the importance of justice, fairness, and toleration to my own well-being, trying to answer Plato's question about the intrinsic relation between justice and the good life in the affirmative, one of the oldest and most difficult questions for a comprehensive theory. Now, the third phase, as I see it, is manifested, as I said, in Dworkin's most recent writings, especially Is Democracy Possible here, but also some of the articles in the book Sovereign Virtue. I call this phase that of humanist liberalism. Here, the theoretical core of the liberal argument consists of two basic principles of human dignity, which is why I think humanist is a good term, and I think Professor Dworkin has applied that term though not in the book I mentioned, but in earlier articles to his approach. The two principles of human dignity are first, that of intrinsic value, which holds that each human life has a special kind of objective value that is to be respected and furthered as a project of success. And the second principle is that of personal responsibility. We have touched on this already in some of our previous discussions. And this states, and I quote, that each person has a special responsibility for realizing the success of his own life, end of quote, which is to provide the main defense of negative liberty, state neutrality, and for a liberal, tolerant society. Now, in my remarks, I want to focus on this third, this humanist vision. In the light of the first two phases of his work, I think I would find Professor Dworkin's argument for a liberal, tolerant society somewhat ambivalent. For I think there are two readings one could give of the argument he gives for toleration. And they both refer to long-standing traditions in liberal thought. So in a sense, what I try to do here is to place Professor Dworkin within that tradition, or rather two strands within that tradition. The one is a basically Lockean tradition. The other I connect to a thinker which is much less known, namely Pierre Bayle. But for those of you who know Bayle or who know what I make of him, you will see that for me he is 17th century Rawlsian. And I hope if I could have a conversation with him, he would agree. I'm not sure he would. Anyway, let me start with a few remarks about toleration and why in posing my questions, I think it is most useful to start with this term. The general concept of toleration is to be explained by three components, namely one of objection, one of acceptance, and one of rejection. A tolerated belief or practice has to be judged as false or bad in order to be a candidate for toleration. But apart from these reasons for objection, there have to be reasons why it would still be wrong not to tolerate false or bad beliefs of such a kind. That is, reasons of acceptance, which must not eliminate reasons of objection, but trump them in a given context. And third, there have to be reasons for rejection, which mark the famous limits of toleration. Now, there are many arguments one could give and that have been given for why to tolerate things which are wrong. And one of the most influential arguments, of course, and this is an argument which Professor Dworkin's principle of responsibility alludes to, is undoubtedly the classic defense of the freedom of conscience. And for this argument, to understand it, Locke's letter on toleration still is a good place to go, even though the argument for the freedom of conscience is much older, is to be found in the writings of the early Christians already. Locke's central idea is that it is in the superior interest of a human being to take care of his immortal soul so as to achieve salvation. This is, as Locke says, the highest obligation, we could also say responsibility, a human being has toward himself as a being created by God. And so ultimately, it is a duty owed to God, not to yourself as an individual. According to Locke's Protestant conception of this duty, no other human being or institution has any authority regarding the relation between an individual and God. Each one stands alone before God on the basis of his own conviction and conscience. Now, in a further step, as you all know, Locke distinguishes this highest interest in salvation from civil interests which the state has to take care of, such as the protection of life, liberty, and possessions. Explaining this essential distinction, Locke gives a number of reasons. First, an individual must not hand over spiritual authority to a human institution because, I quote, "It appears not that God has ever given any such authority to one man over another," end of quote. So doing so would be a sin, actually. Second, human beings cannot leave the care for their soul to another for an epistemological reason mainly. Quote, For no man can, if he would, conform his faith to the dictates of another. All the life and power of true religion consists in the inward and full persuasion of the mind, and faith is not faith without believing." End of quote. So far, so good. I come back to Professor Dworkin's work in a second, but let me make another short detour to a wonderful author in that period, Jonas Proest, the Anglican priest, who scrutinized Locke's view critically. He did not, as many think, deny that sincere faith cannot be produced by external force. But he did argue that force can still be very efficient, indirectly, for the purpose of bringing human beings to the truth, namely as a liberating, an eye-opening force. Here's what Proest says: "If force be used not instead of reason and arguments, that is not to convince by its own proper efficacy, which it cannot do, but only to bring men to consider those reasons and arguments which are proper and sufficient to convince them, but which without being forced they would not consider, who can deny but that indirectly and at a distance it does some service toward the bringing men to embrace that truth?" So Proest argues that there is a highest responsibility of persons to rid themselves of false beliefs and to guide their life in light of the truth and to seek the truth. And so some indirect use of force can help them to liberate themselves from the false ways which they have gone on to and to see the truth. So why am I telling this story? Professor Dworkin's principle of responsibility is clearly conscious of the problematic of Locke and Proest's critique, and thus holds that, quote, "We must not accept the right of anyone else to force us to conform to a view of success that, but for that coercion, we would not choose," which is a quote from Is Democracy Possible here. But how would a Proestian, a neo-Proestian, respond? And for a second, allow me to try and perceive and reproduce what a Proestian would say, since Jeremy Waldron this morning defended, for the sake of argument, legal positivism, and Tom Nagel, just for the sake of argument, for a certain time defended a naturalist conception of practical reason. So I might as well, for a second, try and find out what a Proestian would respond to Professor Dworkin's argument. He would point out that Locke as well as Dworkin rightly stress that, another quote from Professor Dworkin's book, "Each person has a special responsibility for realizing the success of his own life." And that, another quote, "We suppose that those who lack a proper appreciation of the importance of leading a good life lack personal dignity," end of quote, that they, another quote, "fail to appreciate something of objective value, which is the importance of their own lives being a success and not a failure," end of quote. So the modern neo-Proestian would say that responsibility is a term indicating a tripartite structure of a person being responsible for a certain action to a certain authority. And he would furthermore say that even though we could, the neo-Proestian is a rather tolerant person, we could leave the authority place open and not fill in God, but still there clearly would be some attitudes of being responsible towards your own life and the success of it that could call for state intervention. He would say clearly, whatever standard you measure, there are more responsible and less responsible ways of leading your life. And he would say, what is your argument against helping those who lead a less responsible life, to help them to get on the right track? With indirect help, of course, this neo-Proestian would stress. The aim would be the ethically responsible person taking charge of his or her own life as something of objective importance, not being, as the older Proest said, negligent or careless. Explaining the meaning of objectivity, the Proastian would stress that your life is not just your project. It is a gift you have to take care of properly, because otherwise, why would you say it has objective value? Responsibility, in short then, is a double-edged sword in the history and the presence of liberal thought. Now, for a moment, allow me to turn to a third thinker in the 17th century, namely the already mentioned Huguenot Pierre Bayle. Bayle looked for an alternative argument for toleration because he anticipated, having studied Augustine, who had used similar arguments against freedom of conscience in his later work, he could anticipate Proastian, anti-Lockean arguments. In his argument for toleration, then, two things needed to be established. First, an independent and categorical moral duty of justifying one's actions that concern others with reciprocally acceptable reasons, reasons that you have not just fabricated from your own religious beliefs, but reasons that could be accepted by those with whom you do not share a certain faith. Second, it would have to be established that there is a way of questioning absolute religious truth claims that, if not questioned, could be used as trumps in such a justificatory exchange. The Catholic convertists, as Bayle called them, argued essentially that the way they treated the Huguenots was justified because, quote from Bayle, only evils done to the faithful can be properly called persecution. Those exercised on heretics are only acts of kindness, equity, justice, and right reason, which, according to Bayle, I quote again, is the most abominable doctrine that has ever been imagined, for there would be no kind of crime which would not become an act of religion by that maxim. So, end of quote. Bayle saw that this argument for toleration was in need of an independent capacity for moral practical reason, and even though in the long evolutionary story that Professor Nagel brought into play, this period of the 17th century is a very small part, but there is here the evolution of a demand for an independent moral argument for toleration that would be independent from specific faith, which I find very important. So there is the need for an independent capacity for moral practical reason to direct persons' actions, and also the presupposition of an epistemological component of the relativization of truth claims without falling into skepticism. I won't say much more here about this epistemological component because it is not in the foreground of what I want to pose as a question to Professor Dworkin. So where does this leave us with respect to the question of the justification of toleration? Within contemporary liberal theory, the most prominent justification is the one, I think, we find in Professor Dworkin's second phase of ethical liberalism. As it seems to me, it's a heir to Lockean plus Millian discourse, though now the argument, of course, that only inner and authentic faith can lead to salvation has been transformed into the argument that only an ethically autonomous life lived from the inside, as it were, on the basis of autonomously chosen and reflectively endorsed values could be called a good life. Toleration then is called for out of respect for the other as someone with a life to be led well and as an ethically autonomous being whose convictions must not and cannot be forced upon him or her. Professor Dworkin's tenor lectures present a very elaborate version of such an argument from ethical autonomy. According to the challenge view of ethics that he expounds there, the good life lies, and I quote, in its performance as a response to a set of challenges rather than in its product, as the alternative impact model would have it. Without going into the details of Ronald Dworkin's fascinating account of the challenge model, it is important that in his constitutive view of the good, no life can be good if it is not endorsed by the person who leads it, which is essential for the justification of toleration. The main argument against paternalistic intolerance, then, is the rejection of the assumption, and I quote again, that a person's life can be improved just by forcing him into some act or abstinence he thinks valueless, end of quote. Now, to sum up, from a neo-Balian perspective, such a neo-Lockean argument for the respect of personal autonomy encounters important problems, and I think I counted 5 if they are separate problems. First, a neo-Balian looks for a universalizable argument for toleration that carries categorical force with it. And despite Professor Dworkin's view that such is the case with the challenge view, one may reasonably doubt the categorical force of that view. For couldn't one also reasonably hold alternative conceptions of a good life, be it the impact view, as problematic as it is, or another one which finds the idea of mastering challenges far too ego-centered and competitive? It seems that there is a reasonable range of possibilities of conceptualizing the good life. The challenge view is one of them, a good candidate. But in order to rest the argument for toleration on a justification with categorical force, it seems the challenge view is too particular a view to carry that force. Second, a neo-Balian would fear that whenever an ethical view of the autonomous life, or the autonomous good life, is the basis for toleration, ethical judgments about worthwhile ways of life may encroach upon the drawing of the limits, which is explicitly what Professor Dworkin wants to avoid, but which, if you think of Locke's famous letter on toleration, Locke did argue because he held that authentic belief was not a belief Catholics or atheists could hold. Why then, for example, tolerate different ways of life equally that support autonomy and the idea of challenge in very different degrees? So if your argument for toleration is based on the challenge view, why respect ways of life equally if they conform to that view in very different degrees, to very different degrees? Third, one could generally doubt whether it is true that personal autonomy is a precondition for the good life. In how far can we really say that a life led on the basis of mere convention or lack of alternatives is subjectively less fulfilling or objectively less valuable? It is, sure, less autonomous, but in what sense is it less good, and how strong is the conviction that it is? Fourth, a neo-Balian would still worry that even if we agreed on the challenge endorsement argument and said that only a life lived from the inside based on one's own settled convictions, the Augustinian Proastian challenge would remain. There might be effective and mild educational ways to bring inner convictions of mine forth that I would fully identify with after that kind of externally induced conversion. If we want to argue that it was wrong for Augustine to argue for the forceful conversion of the Donatists in his time, what is our argument? Do we say that the most forceful argument against forced conversion is that the life of those who have undergone this in the future will be inauthentic or less valuable? And from which standpoint would we say that? Their autonomy has been violated, but in what sense is this judgment connected to the quality of their life before or after their conversion? Now, finally, if we resorted to a more formal view of personal responsibility, as Professor Dworkin does in his humanist phase, we might still carry some ethically loaded ideas around of what distinguishes a responsible from an irresponsible way of leading a life, around which, as I said, a neo-Proastian could, which a neo-Proastian could use as a reason for restricting certain liberties. So, what does this alternative between a Lockean reading and a Balian reading of the argument for toleration and about liberty and autonomy come down to? It might come down to a choice between two different notions of dignity as a ground for our arguments for toleration or for a liberal state. The neo-Lockean notion of dignity takes persons as ethically autonomous beings with a special responsibility to take charge of their life and to guide it towards success as something of objective importance. Your life, in a sense, is entrusted to you as a project to be realized and perfected. Respecting this dignity of persons thus presupposes the acceptance of that particular view of the good, it seems to me. The second, the neo-Balian conception of dignity is, at least that would be my claim, agnostic about the good and calls for an unconditioned respect of other persons, as I call it, right to justification, their right not to be subjected to any norms or, as you have it, actions or institutions that cannot properly be justified towards them. The reason for this is not that such respect is a precondition for leading a good life. Rather, it is an expression of your equal standing to others as a discursive, a morally autonomous reason-giving and reason-receiving being. One can reasonably deny certain views of the good, yet one cannot reasonably deny that kind of right to justification when it comes to the question of organizing a political community. Toleration then means that even though you strongly believe a certain practice of others to be ethically wrong, you still see that these reasons of ethical objection are not strong enough to deny those who hold such a view the right to that practice. Now, I would like to suggest that the best way to provide Professor Dworkin's recently developed idea of a tolerant, secular society with a normative rationale is the Balian view. To be sure, the way he uses the principle of responsibility shows an ambivalence between a neo-Lockean and a neo-Balian strategy, or the first and the second phase of Professor Dworkin's work. The neo-Lockean briefly insists that, and I quote from the recent book, faith must be a matter of conviction from within, not compulsion from without, end of quote. And the neo-Balian strategy consists of a general refusal of any subordination imposed without proper reasons, or, in Professor Dworkin's words, without sound distributive or sound impersonally judgmental justifications. This means that even though Professor Dworkin links the two strategies of justification, I think they should be separated, for one need not make a statement about the quality of life of an ethically constrained person to argue that such constraint is illegitimate. One just needs to insist on a justificatory threshold or barrier against the illegitimate exercise of force. And I think this is in line with one of Professor Dworkin's strongest statements in that context, and I end with this quote: "I must reject manipulation, even if the values it is designed to protect or instill are my own values, because my dignity is as much outraged by coercion intended to freeze my values as by coercion intended to change them," end of quote. Unpacking what dignity means here, we find, I think, the basic right to justification, which draws a justificatory barrier around my autonomy. Hence, arguing against intolerance, we do not have to get into a competition about which life is better and under which conditions. Essential, rather, is the justificatory standing of persons as equals. Thank you.
It's been a wonderful day for me. I've enjoyed every bit of this. To end the day by being compared serially to John Locke, Pierre Bayle, and even a touch of Proast is more than even a greedy person could accept without, without some shame. People do resist, I think, finding their life carved into phases. But I agree with you that the very early articles about neutrality gave way to a different view in the later articles. In the early article, as you say, I had signed on to a view that political decisions should be completely neutral towards ethical theories. And I modified that view later. I will say something about how I think the modification takes place, but I think that's right. I think that the distinction I made later, which you notice, between discontinuity and continuity, between personal values and political values, is an important distinction, and that I have been aiming in recent work to establish a greater continuity, not just in political philosophy, but in other parts of philosophy as well. Now, the question of whether we need an ethical account in order to justify toleration and to justify a kind of secular state of the sort I defend in the book about democracy is indeed a very important one. And your argument is, I think, calls for what I would understand as a return to the original position, not in the sense in which that term is ordinarily used, but a return to a more neutral view, neutral towards ethics, and to substitute for the view that I take as fundamental, a certain view about personal responsibility, to substitute for that a view about reciprocity and the acceptance of appealing only to ideas that are acceptable to all people in the community. What holds me back from that view is my thought that that would disable political decision altogether. I can't think of any view, for example, about distributive justice, which is equally acceptable to all members of the community in a sense that would be strong enough to rule anything out. Let me ask this question. We can make the distinction, if you're thinking about what's acceptable to people, between the following claims. This theory of distributive justice, this egalitarian theory, is something that every member of the community could accept if he or she changed his other convictions. Well, that's true of any religious view as well. Would accept if he thought hard and long about it. Not necessarily true. Would accept if a little proastrian pulling out of the fingernails occurred. Yes? Yes, I suppose in that case he would accept it. But none of these are going to discriminate between a religious view on the one hand and a view about what people should owe to others and how the collective resources of the community should be distributed. So I think it either has too much bite and would rule out all justification, or has too little bite. I believe that one way or another, we have to make good on the distinction between the ethical and the moral/political. It's a hard distinction to draw, but I think we have to make good on that distinction. And we have to do it not because we have to answer those who say a little force applied in the right place will do a world of good, but because we have to answer what I myself think is the best contemporary argument for state endorsement of religion, or partial state endorsement of religion. The best argument is not the argument that Locke had to deal with, which is about the salvation of the people who are coerced. The best argument is a majoritarian democratic argument. I understand people say in the United States now, arguing that there ought to be religious celebration in the public schools. There ought to be displays of Christian iconography in the public squares. There ought to be more association of the United States explicitly with the Christian religion in foreign policy, for example. Why? Not because it's necessary for the salvation of souls, but because the majority find it a more appropriate environment in which to lead the lives that they themselves, out of their own convictions about a good life, want to lead. They want to live in a Christian society. They want to raise their children to Christian values. They particularly do not want homosexuality recognized, not because they want homosexuals to be saved, but because they want their own children not to be tempted, and they want the public culture to be free of the kind of displays which they find unpleasant. That's an argument that it seems to be can only be met with this kind of reply. We need to distinguish between those decisions that must be made collectively within the community and therefore must be subject to some majoritarian political process, one decision for all, and those decisions that should be left to individuals one by one. The distinction can't, I fear, be made by saying that we'll make the distinction between matters that affect everyone and matters that affect only one person. Mill's idea, Mill's distinction between self-regarding and other-regarding conduct seems to me no longer tenable. Everything that I do in the public space and even in the private space affects the general culture in which everyone lives. The lives of homosexuals on the street do change the culture in which people bring up their children. So we can't make the distinction we need by saying we're only going to leave to individuals what affects them alone. We need a different and a more difficult distinction. And the distinction that I want to make, if we can, is a distinction between collective decisions that would rely for a justification on a moral theory about how people should treat one another. I want to distinguish that from collective decisions that rest on an ethical theory about the best way to live and the best way to try and get one's children to live. These are not easy distinctions. That's not an easy distinction to make. But it does seem to me, with due deference to Locke, Proest, and even Pierre Bayle, that that's where the action now is. So I'm going to continue to try to defend the idea, which is, as you say, very different from the idea with which I started, that we need to defend a very abstract ethical view about personal responsibility in order to explain why the majority can't have the kind of environment imposed on everyone that it prefers.
We have no disagreement with that last conclusion of yours, that this is exactly the distinction we should aim at, namely decisions about how people should treat one another and ethical decisions about how best to live. Where we have a disagreement is what role an ethical view of responsibility should play in making that distinction. And since you forgave me for splitting you up, I would say that the view I would be defending would be the view that most important for making that decision, what is a legitimate ground for deciding a case like same-sex marriage or others, is the respect we owe to others as equals in their justificatory standing as citizens.
Yes.
And so if a claim denies that equality to others by using a certain idea of the nature of marriage or whatever, or what bringing their children decently up means, then if it fails the test of reciprocity, if they ask a right that they deny to others, then I think the principle of respecting others as equals has the bite that we both are looking for. And my only worry is that if we connect this principle of respect to others as equals in their standing as full participatory members of society, if we connect this to a view about what it means to lead your life responsibly, then someone who would say that someone who had a very particular view of what a responsible life means with respect to their children might find an entry, a door into our argument, which neither you nor me would like to open up. And so that is the worry that remains.
There isn't a way in which they could find a way. It's a question of the levels of abstraction. Right. You say some people might think a life of a rather conventional sort with no eccentricity, not much glamour, but a life rooted in community is the best kind of life. There's nothing in what I say about personal responsibility that takes sides against that view. So it's a very abstract commitment, and it's not one that I think would drive a wedge amongst people. It would, however, take sides against people who believe that religion should be imposed. It would take sides against Proast, a man for whom I'm beginning to have increased affection. We need a whipping, boy. But let me go back to your suggestion about reciprocity. Because there is an argument that imposing a state religion, for example, in a society in which the large majority are Christians, is perfectly consistent with treating people as equals. You count the preference and position of each, one by one. You do that about the decision we talked about earlier, whether to have a football stadium or a new opera house. We don't say we have failed to treat people who like music as equals because the vast number prefer a football stadium and that's what we've got. That isn't denying reciprocity or equal concern or furnishing reasons they can't accept. So the question is why we can't construct a parallel argument in the case of religion. There are other, or in the case of sexual orientation, as it's called. Why can't we construct a parallel argument? Of course we defer to the interests and the opinions of the minority. We listen to them with great conviction and all due respect, and then we count heads and we find they're vastly outnumbered. So, as in the case of the football stadium, we established the Christian religion, and now there are crosses in the public schools, and we've paid due respect to everyone's opinion. No, I'm afraid there's harder work to be done than just treating people as equals. We have to explain why treating people as equals reaches one result in the case of opera houses and sports stadium and another result in the case of religion. And I'm afraid we're going to have to get into the difference between certain kinds of conviction and others to do that.
Right. Well, we've got 5 minutes left. I'm just wondering about what we might do. would you like to sum up, or shall we ask somebody in the audience? I think probably we've got time for 2 or 3 questions.
All right, but I think the two of you have been so generous in letting other people speak that you might sum up.
No. I think
you're suggesting the impossible to us.
Total impossible. But maybe we could call for some 1 or 2 questions on anything that occurred since this morning, a long time ago.
Perhaps Professor Deisenhouse or Christodoulidis? Yeah.
Emilios.
Yes, Emilios Christodoulidis, University of Glasgow. I wanted to take you briefly back to the discussion, this morning's discussion about law and fairness. And I wanted to ask you a question about a situation where considerations of justice might clash with considerations of fairness. And the question I had in mind is whether it can ever be claimed that fairness is served through keeping faith with unjust principles. And the reason I think this is a particularly important question in your theory is because there is at least a possibility to read integrity in this way, that if you have an injustice, and if you have an incursion, once an injustice makes an incursion into a legal system, it might be that under the propelled by fit or the idea of consistency, it actually proliferates under its own momentum. So you might have an injustice incurring the legal system, sometimes under the guise of principle, and then consistency in decision-making requires that one remains faithful to it. And I had in mind also situations, to be realistic, where you might have a principle that can be justified in abstract, but seen as unjust at the level of application. So you might have protection of property, for example, in a situation where the vast majority of people are propertyless, which might lead to an unjust. In that kind of clash of fairness and justice, what would the best reading of law be? And would the best reading introduce a set of criteria that allow us considerations of political philosophy, or are they going to fold back into law? So the best reading of law is one that ultimately relies on a self-reference, sort of functional criteria.
That's quite a question for the end. It's, if I may say so, an extremely deep question. I think that the paradigm that I suggested this morning as a kind of shift is one that would respond to your question in a rather different way from the more orthodox approach. If you think of integrity as something which is a almost definitional feature of a separate body of ideas, a separate universe of discourse, and then you ask, how is it connected to morality? This is the view that I want to explore getting away from. Then I think your last suggestion might be a very powerful one, that there'd be a self-referential, so that integrity might require the continuation of injustice. And then the question would be revolution. That is, you'd say, there is a legal system that no longer commands political obligation. That would be a possible approach. But I'm tempted to think about it in the opposite way, as thinking of the ultimate questions as questions of political morality. So that integrity isn't the ultimate principle. It's a principle that you arrive at through concern of fairness, but it wouldn't be the only concern. So that the first question you would ask would be the question parallel to the question the mother asked in the exact little fable that I told, namely, is there any reason to continue respect for a certain tradition? And that That could be, if you think of law as embedded within political morality, that could be seen as a very deep legal question, a question anterior to integrity. It was only when you had passed that threshold and said that there is good reason of fairness, of expectation, of reliance, of stability, for continuing the system, as there almost always would be, that you reach the level of asking what integrity requires. And then your very good question would say, but there might be some circumstances in which the answer to the very threshold question would be, no, there isn't. These various concerns about fairness, reliance, expectation don't satisfy some threshold requirement. And we do not have a reason for seeking integrity with what has gone before. It's possible. I'll tell you in a year whether I...
One more?
Yeah.
Emmanuel, Medical Research, Ministry of Health, Tanzania. Can you reflect on your views?
If there's time, I have very short.
Emmanuel, Ministry of Health, Tanzania. Can you reflect your views where, in a case where the children are denied vaccination in northern Nigeria because the parents don't believe on vaccination, and as a result, the children develop polio and they become disabled, and it becomes a burden to the society. And where should the limits for the government to intervene, respecting the right on belief of the parents?
I've been instructed to provide a short answer to that question, and therefore it may seem brutal. I am strongly in favor of protecting the children from their parents. When the state of medical knowledge establishes that that is strongly for that benefit and carries no risk. It's of course different if there's a risk, but in vaccination there isn't anymore, and it's crucial that they have it. I would not respect the right of a parent to deny that kind of protection to a child. That's brutal. I mean, I can understand that I'm cutting through many arguments, but I'm just reporting my view to you.